Are you craving a trip on Space Mountain? Well, we've got the next best thing. Welcome to Disney Coast to Coast.
Hey folks, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast, the ultimate unofficial Disney fan podcast. I'm Jeff DePauli, and today on the show, Disney author and Renaissance man Jeff Curdy is joining me to discuss traditional classical music often associated with Christmas and winter that you can find in various Disney projects. We discuss that and so much more right after this. If you're still looking for the perfect holiday gift for the Disney fans in your life, why not consider getting them the Disney Coast to Coast 2021 calendar? You can order it as either a wall calendar or desktop calendar. The calendar features original photographs taken by me at the Disneyland and Walt Disney World resorts. And to make it even better, 20% of the profits from any calendar ordered before the end of 2020 will go to the cast member pantry, helping Disney cast members who lost their jobs. This is a win-win-win situation. You're getting a unique gift for a Disney fan in your life, or yourself, you're helping support more free episodes of Disney Coast to Coast, and you're giving to the cast member pantry all at the same time. To order your DCTC 2021 calendars, head to DisneyCoastToCoast.com or click on the link in this episode's description.
What makes Disney magic more magical? The holidays.
Hello, Jeff, and welcome back to Disney Coast to Coast. I'm so happy to have you back.
Ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas.
We're all in the Christmas spirit.
I am in the... You know what else are you going to do at home?
I keep encouraging people, I'm like, deck out the halls of your house more than you ever have. I said the same thing about Halloween. I was like, we need to celebrate as much as we can at home because we're spending so much time at home. But today we are talking about something that I find really fascinating is classical music that is associated with Christmas and winter that's used in Disney animated projects. And this is so interesting to me because I don't know about you, but I definitely remember moments as like a young adult hearing a piece of classical music and thinking to myself, I know this. This sounds so familiar. What is this from? And 9 times out of 10, it would be some animated project that you grew up watching.
There's a very funny Jerry Seinfeld joke in one of the Seinfeld episodes where he says the sum total of my knowledge of classical music is from Warner Brothers cartoons.
Yeah.
But, cartoons were, short cartoons beginning way back with the advent of sound were that medium beyond the nascent radio medium where people could hear music other than, wax cylinders and early recorded media and so on. So the development of animation and I guess the more well-known classical music pieces kind of marry the mediums together.
Yeah, the thing that I always find so interesting is I've always loved classical music. Like, even as a young kid, I've enjoyed it, which I know is weird.
Not weird. Me too.
It's uncommon, shall we say. Most people
Peculiar. We're peculiar.
Yeah. But the thing that I always found so fascinating is that people would say that. It would be some of the same people who would rave about people like John Williams, who wrote, Star Wars and Indiana Jones and Jurassic Park and all these amazing scores. I'm like, it's the same thing.
Well, and once again, what is a John Williams score if not a wrought piece of classical music? I mean,
exactly.
You look at even his influences. I look at scores of his that are unusual, like the Reavers. But the Reavers with Steve McQueen back in the 70s. But it has all of that sort of Americana feel of an Aaron Copland composition. And you can tell where the cross-referencing and the influence comes and goes. Obviously the relationship of Star Wars to Gustav Holst and Holst and the Planets. And
yeah.
No genius, I think, takes place in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And to say, oh, I love all the scores of John Williams, but boy, I don't like classical music is sort of like...
It always baffled me. I don't
get it. And I think maybe once again, this is where Disney has been successful in implanting that to us. People equate those Williams scores with the way people feel about the films, or with their memory of the action or the characters or the storytelling of the films. So maybe that's what said they don't have that with a piece of classical music that hasn't been utilized in a film or television application.
Yeah, I always say, and I mean this sincerely, like, I feel so incredibly lucky to be living during the time of John Williams, because people hundreds of years from now are going to look back at him and so many film composers, not just him. He's just, the one everybody talks about. And they are the Mozarts of today. They're the Beethovens of today. And it's incredible to me that we're living during that. I think it's incredible.
Well, and when you think about, for instance, the early days of television, when Leonard Bernstein did his concerts for young people, and the way that he utilized the medium to pass on the understanding of classical music to the young audiences in a new medium, that's really a part of John Williams' genius. In many ways, it's not about inventing something new or revolutionary, and this is a Walt Disney thing to boot. It's utilizing that particular tool and making it new and fresh to a new audience. Whether in Walt's case it was music or art, animation, a piece of technology, I think that's any new, John Williams isn't new, but the introduction to new audiences of a revered, time-honored medium or art form, I guess, really. But I mean, he just won the Royal Philharmonic Society award. Williams did. And, you see how that's like a really revered classical music award. So he's well, and the other thing was he bridged too from film scoring when he took over the Boston Pops and was the face and the musical voice of the Boston Pops for so many years. I think in the way of celebrity conductors, he did that much as Toscanini or Leopold Stokowski did back during the days of radio. Arthur Fiedler had certainly done it before Williams took over the Pops. But again, classical music is classical because it's classical. It's like anything that's a classic. They have endurance because they continue to communicate.
Yeah, and one of the things that one of the good reasons why they would use it in animated stuff was because it was inexpensive. The licensing fees were less expensive. The thing that blew my mind were how large these orchestras were. They'd be about like a 60-piece orchestra to play for an animated short. Like, that's crazy to think about, an orchestra that large for a short.
With a lot of that early music, number one, you had already, because music education, particularly in the middle class of the United States, music education was fairly fundamental because it was one of the media. You didn't have anything else.
Yeah.
So you would get piano lessons, you would take music classes, you learned classical music. So it was a vernacular conversation that you were having with music. Then as it started to be used in film, you have a chicken clucking around a barnyard and you hear Turkey in the Straw and you go, aha, I get that. That's a musical connection to a visual image. The other part of it is too, particularly with Stalling and when he went over to Warner Brothers, he had contract studio musicians. So part of the reasons they could have that sort of, at Warner Brothers particularly, not at Disney, because of course they were solely a cartoon factory, but at Warner's they had contract musicians, so they would, put together an orchestra, and like you said, a 30-piece orchestra wouldn't be uncommon for a short cartoon. And I think that, back to the Seinfeld joke, it really elevated our appreciation and understanding when we finally heard Ride of the Valkyries somewhere else and went, hey, that's Bugs Bunny, killed a wabbit, killed a wabbit. I know
exactly.
that. Yeah. So it's just interesting how this cross-media pollination of animation and music has evolved and developed and informed so many generations.
All right, so let's jump into some of the stuff that the Walt Disney Animation Studio did. And the first one that we're going to talk about is from the 1930. It was a silly symphony called Winter. And First of all, for folks, we always hear the term silly symphony, Disney, silly symphony. Can you explain to people who might not know what that is, what that was exactly?
As corny and old school as it may sound, Walt Disney was this crazy, innovative thinker. And he tended to surround himself with like people. And he was dealing with a medium that he had initially thought was sort of done. When he moved to Hollywood, he thought animation was done. Then he began to look at how you could use the medium, and sound was a huge deal. So he put sound, synchronized sound, heavily reliant on music, once again, in Steamboat Willie and the early Mickey cartoons. They were musicals. All of the action, the character behaviors, and so on was closely linked to a musical score. And a lot of that had to do with Carl Stalling, who had been a colleague of Walt's dating back to Kansas City. So the idea for the Silly Symphonies actually came from Carl Stalling. And he suggested that in addition to the very successful Mickey shorts that had just started being churned out in a regular schedule, he said, how about a series in which we could apply music in a more storytelling fashion, instead of just as a sort of a support and accentuation of character action or the elements of the Mickey shorts, which were really a lot about, of course, plots and gags and stuff. How about something, I think once again, he was it was the very nascent ideas of Fantasia. What can we do where music is the engine of the medium and not just the visuals with music as a support? So, Steamboat Willie had been public domain tunes, Steamboat Bill and Turkey in the Straw, and they Stalling laid out this idea, and they came up with what became Skeleton Dance. Mm-hmm. It had been inspired by Camille Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre. But of course, I think that he still held the rights to that, and it was a licensing issue, to tell you the truth. So none of that tone poem came into use for the film. So Stalling used March of the Dwarfs by Edvard Grieg, and then his own integrated themes. So he created sort of this visual symphony, and it really worked. And it was a hard sell for Walt initially, but then he, of course, ran it, tested it, and against the objection of his distributors, who said, "What's these skeletons? We want more mice." So that really began. And what Walt saw, of course, was this ongoing experimentation, both in the visual form of animation and in the way that music was integrated into the presentation as a storytelling element of equal value to the animation. So the Skeleton Dance really started it off. And so they did additional, and they were standalones. They didn't have Mickey in them, and they didn't have the posters and the promotional material, and the titles said either Mickey Mouse presents a Walt Disney Silly Symphony, or prominently featured Walt Disney's name as he became more well-known. But Stalling continued and did scores for a thing with Bizet's Carmen, which was El Terrible Toreador. That was in 1929. And the Hell's Bells, the Merry Dwarfs. And then these seasonal inspired shorts actually started. You talked about winter. Stalling did springtime and summer and autumn. Mm-hmm. And then, who was it? Bert Lewis, I think, wound up doing the score for winter. But once again, these were visual tone poems, I guess. It's interesting because you look at winter, and a lot of the Silly Symphonies, well, and a lot of animation, but the Silly Symphonies in particular had a similar structure in the sense of a sort of a gag-laden world building at the beginning that was, okay, winter, what does winter say to you? It's freezing and it's snow and it's bears hibernating and it's reindeer and it's, to a broader portion of the audience, what's going to communicate that in music? So, of course, the key piece of musical score to Winter is the Skater's Waltz, which, of course, was a German composition, I think.
Emil Waldteufel? Am I saying that right? Emil Waldteufel?
Yeah, Emil Waldteufel, and he had been inspired by a Renoir painting that was Skaters on the Bois de Boulogne. It was an 1860s very famous painting. So once again, that sort of cross-media pollination of ideas, but the Skater's Waltz had become a very favorite winter theme. And of course, back in the olden days, when you would go out onto the frozen pond in the Central Park with the bandstand, with a little band playing, of course, they'd play what was assumed as winter music for you to skate by and so on. So it's all very sort of evolutionary in the culture. So it's only natural that as the Silly Symphonies progressed, these thematic classical pieces once again then re-identified themselves. And they were to immediately put an audience in a sense of, I understand this. I know what this is.
It's interesting how it was based on, the ice skating. And of course, we see the animals doing that in this short. And it's that very recognizable, the da 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 da, da 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 da. It's a great piece of music. And yeah, it's perfect for this Silly Symphony. And frankly,
Well, and you look at it once again from a standpoint of animation, it also lends itself to movement. So
yes, and gags.
The piece itself, absolutely, and everything in those has to do with the rhythms and the melodies. And so the thing that's interesting to me about Winter is you look at the work in Snow White in 1937 and then the work in Bambi that came out in 1942, and look at the animal anatomy. And you just sort of cover your eyes looking at these crude, reindeer figures skating and very gag-driven stuff and lots of sort of Disney trademark butt jokes. And Walt loved a good rear end joke, But you see the evolutionary nature of animation experimentation at the same time, and the merging of these media into something that's gestalt. It just all of those elements of the art, the movement, the music, and the storytelling, just the whole thing rises and becomes something superior and different.
It's interesting for sure seeing the evolution of that, because Winter, that Silly Symphony, is from 1930. By the way, if you want to check it out, it's easy to find on YouTube. But just 10 years later, 1940, we get Fantasia, and of course the massive Nutcracker sequences in Fantasia, and just the quality of animation just in a 10-year gap is mind-blowing. It's crazy, the detail in Fantasia versus a Silly Symphony. And granted, bigger budget, more time.
Well, and once again, you also have a core team of people who had spent a decade working every day.
Yeah.
And that was the great launching pad of the Silly Symphonies, and the short films was really gaining not only an understanding, but a mastery of what that medium could do. And then as it became with Snow White a more cinematic medium, Nutcracker in Fantasia is it's just such a good example of taking animation in its multiple layers and adding things like photographic effects and physical effects, double exposures, and all kinds of fascinating and interesting things, representing this, what became in the film sort of a nature ballet based on the Tchaikovsky suite. I still think it's breathtaking on so many levels artistically today.
One of the things I found so fascinating about the Nutcracker sequence in Fantasia is that, like we were talking about earlier, a lot of times we will recognize classical pieces of music from animated projects, but this is one of the few cases where I think I knew the piece of music. The Nutcracker is such a Christmas tradition these days that I knew that piece of music before seeing Fantasia, and it was a little confused as to why it wasn't more Christmas-themed animation.
I can tell you why.
And I found out, but please do, yes.
Because the Nutcracker as a Christmas tradition postdates Fantasia.
Isn't that nuts? That's crazy.
We all think, oh my gosh, where's, Clara and the Sugar Plum Fairy and the, Mouse King and all that stuff. The first American production, really, the complete production was in 1944.
So it's 4 years after Fantasia.
Nobody or close to nobody in the audience for Fantasia knew that music beyond maybe listening to recordings or hearing it on the Toscanini broadcast.
That is wild to me because Fantasia kind of made it a much more mainstream piece of music.
I believe you would be correct in saying that. But that 1944 performance was a huge success. San Francisco Ballet was basically founded on that. That's been it's like all the regional theaters that do a Christmas Carol every year, and it's like that pays the bills for the year. We can do whatever other plays we want because at Christmas time we got Ebenezer Scrooge to take up the slack. But that was for San Francisco Ballet. They've presented it through every winter season and done new productions and new designs. And New York City Ballet, which of course is famous for the Balanchine Nutcracker, they didn't do Nutcracker till 1954.
I don't know when the Boston Ballet started, but I know my entire childhood the Boston Ballet was doing it. And that was often a school field trip or whatever.
Well, especially with San Francisco Ballet and then with Balanchine's Nutcracker in 54, it became a thing. Mm-hmm. It turned into a standard. So I think most major ballet companies began looking at Nutcracker in the 1960s. So once again, sometimes the fascinating thing about history in context is this realization that you think, oh, well, that was bold of Walt Disney to do Nutcracker as sort of a ballet on the subject of nature, when everybody knows what the story of the Nutcracker is. In 1940, practically nobody knew what the story of the Nutcracker was.
Yeah, that really blew my mind because, to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the Nutcracker as a show. I think the story is a little bit lame, but I love the music of the Nutcracker so much. And
so do I. I've heard Arabian Dance 4 million times since I first heard it when I was a kid, and it still has this ability to just stop me.
Yeah.
And I just
a lot of the music in that show does.
Listen to it. Well, and the thing is the varied characterizations contained within the musical vocabulary that Tchaikovsky used lend themselves to a visualization. Mm-hmm. The Russian dance with the Cossacks and the Chinese dance with the mushrooms and so on. The idea of the Arabian dance being aquatic, because to be honest, that music sounds aquatic. It feels like swimming in dark waters when you listen to it. I had a lot of opportunities over the years to talk to guys like John Hench about where the inspiration for these came from. And I did documentary work on the first DVD release of Fantasia back in 2000 and got to really delve into these things. But John painted a picture of the studio. At the time, they were on Hyperion. And a lot of the Fantasia story units and creative development was in an old apartment building that was adjacent to the Hyperion studio. And John always said, oh, and the thin walls. And all you'd walk into this set of ramshackle offices they'd set up by taking over this entire apartment building. And all you'd hear is these record players all the time playing these. He said that he was next door to a group that was developing Swan of Tuonela, which is probably one of the saddest pieces of music in creation. And I remember John saying, when they stopped development of The Swan of Tuonela, I was really happy because that music really got to me.
Oh, that's so funny. Well, the Nutcracker is much happier, thankfully.
Well, and you know, the nice thing too is the variety within it. If you're within a
Yes.
nature ballet, and that's sort of the thesis of the thing, is it's a ballet of nature and seasons. It does lend itself to that interpretation and to create something poetic and balletic and in motion out of themes and symbols and the activity of nature is I don't think a lot of this kind of work gets the attention it deserves. There's still a lot of poo-pooing of high culture and low culture, and of course, I think it was it was Ollie Johnston said the film critics loved it and the music critics hated it. Because in essence, I think a lot of the music critics felt it was bastardizing the purity of classical music,
Yeah. Where they should have really just been excited at the fact that it was introducing this music to an entirely new audience. Like, as you said, people didn't even know the score to the Nutcracker back in 1940. So.
Well, and can you imagine, had they ever heard Stravinsky's Rite of Spring? God, no. I mean, that was a radical piece of music. That was a piece that caused riots on its premiere, So for Walt Disney to do Stravinsky this was really bold. And I think the heart of it, people always say, the heart of the movie is really The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And I always think, you know what? That might be the soul of the movie.
I was going to say, that's the one that everybody thinks of, I think, when you say Fantasia. And it's the one that got people's butts in the seats.
And it's the one where it started. Walt wanted to do this and hired Stokowski and said, let's do this. And Stokowski said, we should do a concert with animation. Yeah. And that they called the working title of Fantasia was the concert feature for the longest time. But I think Mickey is sort of the soul and spirit of where the idea came from. But I think the Nutcracker Suite is really the heart of that movie. It really, to me, is sort of the elevated moment in that movie where you recognized how artful that combination of visuals and music could be.
I think I know the answer to this question, but you may prove me wrong. Sorcerer Mickey did not exist before Fantasia, right?
No.
Okay. So
Freddie Moore did a complete redesign of Mickey for Fantasia.
Okay.
Mickey's design had evolved over the short cartoons based on the needs of the animators. So he had this sort of wacky design evolution. And ultimately, the beginning of the redesign process started with Freddie and Brave Little Tailor. But Mickey with pupils in his eyes, or pupils within pupils, as Frank Thomas said, because basically that mask around Mickey's eyes was supposed to be the eye, and then the round circle, sometimes with a little pie shape cut out of it, was supposed to be the pupil. But in order to create the ability to do more expressive animation with the eyes, Freddie finally landed on a pupil within a pupil, so to speak. And that mask simply became almost like a hairline for Mickey. But he redesigned Mickey for that and did the model sheets with the robe and the peaked cap, the wizard's cap.
It is really fascinating to think, though, like, even I bet you there are a good amount, especially of young Disney fans out there, who have never seen Fantasia all the way through. So it's pretty incredible to think that Sorcerer Mickey is from that piece and is still a huge part of even just Disney parks today when you think of Fantasmic, or even just photo meet and greets. When Sorcerer Mickey is out, everybody wants to get a photo. It's pretty incredible to think that came from that. And then on top of that, I mean, it's not unrealistic, I think, to say that these annual traditions of seeing the Nutcracker at your local dance company would not exist if it wasn't for Fantasia. Is that going too far?
I don't know. It seems like, doesn't it seem like it from the timing of it all?
It was only 3 or 4 years after Fantasia.
Well, and suddenly Disney, even though you hear, oh, Fantasia was, the legend is Fantasia was a huge failure. Well, it really wasn't. When you look at it, it was like The Lion King. The Lion King made $87 kajillion and everybody on the planet saw it. And then the next movie that came out, Pocahontas, didn't. So it was a failure. Well, no, it wasn't a failure. It did pretty well, and it got really good critical reviews, and the music was glorious, and blah, blah, blah. Fantasia, given the context of how it was released and the exhibition of it as a road show, an event, a musical event, it was treated as a concert down to curtain timings and auditorium lighting, and it was an extraordinary show. But it ran for a year on Broadway. It ran for a year at the Carthay Circle in Los Angeles, ran for almost a year in San Francisco. So what it seems to have done, though, is the people who knew what they were getting into adored it. And a lot of people went thinking it would be Snow White and were baffled.
And which is totally understandable.
Completely. But you also see that with all of the things working against it into 1941 and the onset of the war, the lack of the European market, the inability, in many ways, the complete mechanical inability to put in the stereo sound systems.
Yeah.
They could not continue the roadshow model. So Walt sort of threw up his hands, gave it back to RKO, because he had distributed it himself. He had done all of the roadshow presentations under his own distribution. He gave it back to RKO. They truncated it from, what's the running time on that thing? 125 minutes or so. It's 2 hours plus. They did a cut version that was, I think, 88 minutes. But the Nutcracker was in it. So once again, I think you had that out in the zeitgeist, as they say when they're trying to be fancy about what is sort of hanging out there in pop culture. So to your original question, which I went way off the beam about, I believe you could certainly point to the fact that the Nutcracker suite was suddenly around.
Yeah.
In 1940. And who knows what that moment of innovation is where the San Francisco Ballet creative director went, gee, I just saw Fantasia last night, Nutcracker. What a glorious piece. And nobody's done it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the history.
And once again, in my many years with Disney, I've seen even dumber inspirations where somebody goes, hey, we ought to do something like that. And then, something blossoms or explodes. So I don't think you're way off the beam by saying, Disney, I think, thrust the Tchaikovsky work back into popular recognition where it hadn't been. And certainly, I think, could be seen as a seed of that creative rebirth for the ballet.
Now, this next piece, what's really interesting, we talked about that jump from 1930 to 1940 and how much greater the animation got. And now this next jump, we're going to 1946 with the Peter and the Wolf segment from the Make Mine Music package film, essentially. And this is considerably less grand when it comes to the animation style because of honestly, I kind of feel like we're in the middle of this right now, but they were trying to recover from World War II and looking to save money and making cheaper animations that they were hoping they could make some money off of. I feel like we're in that right now, hopefully looking at the finish line of this pandemic and, belts are being tightened to keep the company afloat, as they say. But it's just really interesting to see. There's going to be a period of time where we're going to have to deal with lesser in order to survive. And I feel like that's kind of what Peter and the Wolf is. As much as I love it, it's this beautiful winter, short in the middle of this package film. But it's nothing compared to Fantasia.
When the war was over, and this is something I admire about Walt Disney, very early in his life, he experienced terrible failure. And he said, widely quoted at a certain point, there's nothing like a good, hard failure when you're young. And what he said is that it made him fearless. because he'd failed. He'd lost everything and he'd come back. So when he would do this, when he would have a failure, what he would do is almost instinctively assess his liabilities and his assets. And that's what happened after the war. The war left him essentially sort of bereft. I don't know how he had lost key talent. He had lost momentum that had been building through Fantasia and Dumbo and Bambi. He had lost the European market and would have to rebuild there. And one of the things that he did was, as we often do when it's, the day before the big Costco trip, we go, there is nothing in the house to eat. So we go and we make fantastic casseroles and goulashes and God knows what all from what's in the pantry. And that's kind of what he did after the war. He went and looked at everything that had been in process, that had been in development, and the package features became an ability to put feature-length Disney product out to the theaters, on a shoestring. So this was all moving toward simply setting up shop again, paying the bills. This is one of those moments. Walt had a couple of these moments in his career where he could easily have closed up shop after the war. As a matter of fact, Samuel Goldwyn, the famous producer, was a very good friend of Walt's. Walt the anti-Semite? Yeah, Samuel Goldwyn was one of his best buddies. It was interesting. I was looking through Walt's desk diaries, and I kept seeing dinner, Sam and Francis. And it finally occurred to me, he's having dinner with Samuel Goldwyn and his wife, Frances, like once a month for most of his life. So Goldwyn was a really good friend of Walt's. And after the war, Goldwyn basically said, set up a producer shingle over here. You want to do live action, you want to do some animation, whatever you want, you'd be an independent producer and come be at my studio. But Walt chose to hang on to, and I think a lot of it, to be honest, he had loyalty to his art form. He had loyalty to his brand name, which they probably didn't call it back then. Walt never probably thought of himself as, or referred to himself as, a brand. But I think he also felt a loyalty to the people who had worked and stayed with him. So putting the package features together was a simple way. And of course, they follow the pattern of Fantasia.
They very much do. It's just such a different quality.
The quality of animation is not as elevated. It's not as expensive. It's not as experimental, except in certain ways. You look at things like Bumble Boogie with the Freddie Martin Orchestra, and it's very fantastically representational abstraction that's really cool. And of course, most of that material is set to popular music and not to classical music. But he had a couple of things left over from Fantasia. He had completely animated and scored Clair de Lune, which was meant to go into... Fantasia was meant to be a concert. So you would go see Fantasia at Christmas time, 1940, and it would still be playing at Christmas time of 1941, but there would be a new program order and new segments. So Clair de Lune had been animated and was done. And they took the animation from Clair de Lune and set it to a popular song called Blue Bayou and put it into a package feature. Peter and the Wolf had been developed for Fantasia. Once again, very famous classical piece.
Prokofiev, right?
Prokofiev.
1936, yep.
And once again, very literal storytelling in Peter and the Wolf.
Yes.
What happened in its translation, and I'm not sure, I'd have to do a little more thinking and a little more research, but in its translation to a post-war sensibility, this is the other thing, once again, in context. The post-war culture was a great deal about re-identifying and getting over extraordinary loss. So the tonality became more sprightly and brighter in those films. Of course, Peter and the Wolf is a somewhat dark tale.
Yeah, it is.
But the way to utilize the music, create the character sketches that are so clearly delineated in the music, and then to tell that story was probably just too tonally inappropriate for the audiences of the time. Also, probably a lot less expensive to go to something more of a movement and gag-driven animation style. So, and I mean, you don't even get, Sonia doesn't even die in the Disney.
Oh, does she in the original?
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
So, but the other thing that came into it, I'm not sure it needed it except for a convivial tonality, was the Sterling Holloway narration.
Yeah, that is interesting to me. So Sterling Holloway, for Disney fans, of course, would recognize his voice as Winnie the Pooh, and he narrates this. And yeah, it is one of those things because this piece was written to teach children the instruments of the orchestra. And even at the beginning.
And think of how appropriate that would have been had it been envisioned in the context of Fantasia 7 years before.
Absolutely. That would have been a great opener for Fantasia, really. It would have been interesting to see this animated for a Fantasia with that high quality of animation. And I keep talking like this is a piece of crap, but it's not. I actually really like Peter and the Wolf quite a bit. It's just not Fantasia.
Well, and it's once again, it's, things are what they are and are not what they are not. It's like my favorite Amazon reviews of the books that I've written. The ones that are my favorite are, "This is not what I expected." Well, as an author, I don't really have much authority over your expectations.
Yeah.
You kind of have to take it at the value of what is there. And Peter and the Wolf has gorgeous things about it. I just feel it's a little bit flat and superficial in terms of its approach and its design. And then there was a story, and I don't know how true it is, but one of the animators told me Sterling Holloway was a regular, a stalwart. It just from Mr. Stork in Dumbo on through Peter and the Wolf and up to Winnie the Pooh and
isn't he the snake in Jungle Book?
Ka the snake. My point being that Holloway was a reliable character voice in the sense that he was that voice where the audience went, oh, because he was so prevalent in radio. And of course, a lot of the great voice actors in Disney films came out of radio. And in the olden days, radio was everywhere. So one of the animators said at some point, we knew we were in trouble with a character if Walt said we could get Sterling Holloway to do that.
Oh, no.
Because
really?
what he was saying is, I'm not getting the warmth of this. I'm not getting the humor of this. So it would encourage them to work extra hard to get the character in animation, because Walt was not feeling what they were doing with the character itself and was going, we can prop this up by bringing in a really great voice.
Wow, so Sterling Holloway was kind of a crutch for characters that weren't working.
And I think that there were probably other ones within, the radio actors that Walt knew where he would go, I mean, he was the one who, when they were doing Shere Khan, I think it was Walt who brought up, they were looking for Basil Rathbone, and that was what the animators had their mind on. And Walt was like, I think George Sanders. I think Basil Rathbone is too nice. And of course, he was right. So, of course, he knew these from being an avid moviegoer and also from being a radio listener, as everybody was in those days. So you see the animated films populated with these great radio stars. It's very interesting, once again, in context, to go back, listen to a bunch of old radio shows. And of course, you think of Marvin Miller reading the opening of Sleeping Beauty. Very sort of sartorial fairy tale voice.
It is funny because Disney certainly had his troupe of voice actors that he used a lot. And
well, you look at people like Verna Felton was a classic radio actor, and she was in Dumbo and Sleeping Beauty, and her lad Cinderella. And then, of course, she played an elephant again at the last thing she did, Disney in Jungle Book. So they were reliable. And the other thing is, I think you knew that you could count on those. But once again, to the point of Peter and the Wolf, I think the accessibility, and I think in a way, I just wonder, maybe they were saying, we're not taking this too seriously with Sterling Holloway. They were lightening it up and making it feel accessible. to their broader audience at the time. Just as we now feel we grew up with the Nutcracker Suite, we grew up with any of the various classical musical pieces that we have in our heads all the time.
I love the music from Peter and the Wolf. I think it's such great melodies. And one of the things, even tighter, Christmas connection to this is I always think of, in fact, the way I first heard a piece of music from Peter and the Wolf was from a very classic Christmas movie. You know what I'm talking about, I assume?
No.
You know A Christmas Story, right?
Oh, of course.
Well, the bully, is it Scut Farkus or something like that?
Scut Farkus.
Dun, 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 is, of course, it's the wolf in Peter and the Wolf.
And once again, isn't that an animation vernacular use of music? Because that's what a Carl Stalling, that's what the great animation composers, Frank Churchill, and they would cue a piece of music like that, and it elevated the joke.
Yeah, now me as a kid, it blew my mind when I heard it in Peter and the Wolf, because the first thing I knew it from was Christmas Story, and honestly thought it was original score to A Christmas Story.
There's so much referential score, though, if you listen to... I was watching The Wizard of Oz the other day for the 957th time in my life, because I'm old. Mm-hmm. But I was picking up on a bunch of stuff that is in the score of the interpolated jokes in the music score. When they go into the forest of the fighting trees, the underscore interpolates in the shade of the old apple tree, the old standard song. And then when they're in the witch's castle and Toto is running up the stairs and showing the three companions where Dorothy is imprisoned, it's Night on Bald Mountain, which we knew from Fantasia. There's a lot of funny, obscure little Brahms lullaby you hear in the poppy field, sort of this wound into the score of it. So this idea of creating an immediate cue, it's sort of like an Easter egg, of an audio Easter egg, and it's kind of there for the people who get it. The people who didn't know Peter and the Wolf, like you didn't when you were a kid,
yeah,
you get the joke later.
Yes.
And you go, oh my gosh, that's such a great joke. And the people who know what that is when they see the movie for the first time just think, wow, that's a good one.
Well, let's take it a step further, even with the Wizard of Oz thing you were talking about. If you go and watch Hocus Pocus, you will hear some Wizard of Oz. Dun, 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 dun. Not exactly like that, but very similar. And, it's, of course, that's the witches theme in Wizard of Oz, and then we got the Witches of Salem in Hocus Pocus. It's all quite clever.
Well, it's just interesting. The interpolate, when I was doing the Walt Disney Family Museum years ago, there were 5 key elements that always intertwine in Walt Disney. And I used to philosophically guide our creative teams back to these ideas, which were art, storytelling, music, innovation, and family. Those were our big pillars, as they call them. If you're being hip in a meeting these days, you talk about your pillars. Those to me were sort of and you drill down from there into a lot of subsets and details and so on. But it's always interesting to me, as we were talking about earlier, the integration of character development and humor through the art, through the music, elevating that storytelling. It's this whole... the whole becomes so much greater than just the sum of the parts in that sense. And I think that's part of the brilliance of Disney animation.
To go back to what we were talking about earlier with John Williams, I always find it so interesting how out of everything he could have chosen to take inspiration from for Star Wars, it was the planets. And I'm like, totally makes sense in the world of Star Wars, doesn't it?
Well, and what's happened more and more is we have gotten into, this was beginning to happen probably in the late 90s, was you were no longer bound to physical film when you were editing your movie together. You were doing a lot of feature films, obviously started digital editing in the mid 90s, particularly, and then accelerating for the next 10 years. What would happen is the editor and the director would frequently lay down a scratch track that gave the feel and the tone of what they wanted there. And a lot of times the sequence had become so married to the scratch track, which was a famous classical piece or a suite or a theme from another movie, that the composer's burden was then to either create a piece of music that let them kill their musical baby that they had been working with to edit to, or that was enough like that scratch track without violating copyrights and people's sensibilities,
Yeah.
So that's always interesting to me too, is the influence of classical and other film music in the film industry in the last 20, 25 years has a lot to do with the editorial process and the ability to put in some Mussorgsky here. I want it to feel like the toccata and fugue in D minor here, or I want that kind of rhythm that we have in the Rite of Spring. Then all of a sudden they're stuck because they've gotten so married to that. But it's an interesting evolution of how music is scored. I'd be interested to talk to some more contemporary composers about situations where that's been the issue.
Yeah, we're going so off tangent, but another thing that always shocks me is when you see like movie commercials on TV and the scores aren't finished, and they often use other movie scores. And one that is used so much is the score to Beetlejuice. You will hear that thing in so many TV ads for movies. It's unbelievable.
That the use of other movie scores in trailers became so common in the late 90s. I started to notice that, and I was like, they were trying to communicate a certain energy or a certain feeling. Yeah. So I get why it was done.
Yeah, it's just jarring when you know what movie it's actually from.
In a lot of movies and a ton of trailers, it was Cavaliera Rusticana over and over again. Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah.
In trailer, because you were sensing action and driving motion and sort of this fiercely masculine kind of music. And it was just like, oh, God, there's another trailer that uses Cavaliera Rusticana again.
Exactly.
So it all holds true to your thesis, which is about the influence of classical music. And think about what you and I have been talking about. I think about the ability, just through that shared cultural memory, that all of these things that we've talked about, whether it's the Skater's Waltz or the Nutcracker Suite or Peter and the Wolf, they all evoke sentimental feelings, romantic feelings about winter. And you get those mind pictures of snow and skating and hibernating bears falling on their butts, like in winter. But they all were used because the creative people knew that's what they would evoke to us. And that has perpetuated itself down the generations. Because of that, it's this cultural, self-feeding, self-propelling energy about those classical pieces that put us in mind of firesides and nutcrackers and cocoa.
Exactly. Yeah, this has been such a fun conversation, but for now, let's get to some trivia.
Do you know the answer? Get your brain gears churning and play along. It's trivia time.
Alrighty, Jeff, do you want to hit me with a trivia question first, or shall I hit you?
This is probably too easy for you, but tell me what the connection is between your movie that you just mentioned, A Christmas Story, and Disney.
I do know the connection. I'm blanking on the name, but the author of A Christmas Story and the narrator of the movie is the voice of Father in the current Carousel of Progress. And I absolutely love that fact. What is his name? I'm blanking.
Gene Shepherd.
Gene Shepherd, who has passed away, yes, I believe. And that makes me so sad because I am, first of all, Carousel of Progress is my number one attraction in Magic Kingdom. But I definitely want to see it updated, but it makes me so sad to think of it updated without Gene Shepherd's voice.
Oh.
So
he was amazing career as a sort of a humorist. He started out in radio, which kind of, once again, back to our conversation about radio. radio, started in radio in Chicago and was a writer. And Christmas Story is based on his reminiscences called In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash. To me, that was an incredible fit when they updated Carousel of Progress to bring in that sort of voice of a Midwestern Americana humorist. And once again, just as we've been discussing, immediately lets the audience know where the tonality of the show is. Because like you sat down that first time with the new show and went, oh my gosh, it's A Christmas Story.
Yeah. You know what voice I've heard thrown around of people saying, oh, when they update Carousel of Progress, this is who I want to hear. Do you have any guesses as to who people might say?
No.
Because it's very similar. It's a very comforting voice. They'd have a little bit of trouble because it might sound too much like a character of theirs, but Tom Hanks would be really interesting.
Well, Tom Hanks is he's the
American sweetheart. Every man.
He is the font of credibility and soulful sincerity.
Yeah.
That's kind of where he lives in the cultural world. Immediately trustworthy, immediately known.
I would be okay with that replacement, honestly. Like, as much as I would miss Gene Shepard, I'm like, Tom Hanks would be pretty darn good.
Well, we can get into another hour of what you would do with the show itself.
We should sometime, because that would be so much fun.
Let's get that one on the calendar, because we can talk about the history of Carousel of Progress, and then we can do some armchair Imagineering.
Listen, next season, we're putting that on the calendar.
Let's do
sure.
it.
Okay, so I got a trivia question for you.
Uh-oh.
We were talking about the silly symphonies earlier. Of course, we were talking most specifically about winter, but they started in 1929.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know when it ended? And a part two, maybe? Can you tell me the first and the last? You already mentioned the first, but do you know the last one?
The first is the Skeleton Dance, and the last one is very often miscredited as Ferdinand the Bull, which was actually done by the Silly Symphony unit.
I got a different title in my research.
But they didn't release it as a Silly Symphony. So I don't know. The last one would have been, 39?
Yep, you're right about the year.
So, and once again, this was the part of the thing when I was growing up. Of course, there were a lot of, what did I have to go to? The encyclopedia. And a lot of times the encyclopedia was just wrong. This is, another great sub-story. I think it's Ugly Duckling. Was the last official Silly Symphony.
Yes, it is.
Which is really interesting because it was a remake. So when everybody gets all bent out of shape about Disney remakes, they had already done Ugly Duckling as a Silly Symphony in, I think, 31, maybe 32? I'm not sure.
No kidding.
So, but that, boy, if you ever want a mind-blowing comparison of what happened in this tiny frame of time in terms of animation storytelling, watch the first Ugly Duckling and then watch the remake, The Last Silly Symphony, because it will blow your mind.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because as we're talking about the Silly Symphonies, we said 1929 to 1939, which means among the Silly Symphonies, we had Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 1937. So obviously huge difference in animation style there. And then right after them, we had Pinocchio in 1940, which is one of the most beautiful animated films ever made. So it's just fascinating how it's kind of like Walt Disney Animation features today versus Disney television animation. That's kind of what the shorts were compared to his features.
Well, and the shorts were all their own unit. And they were all in their own building. And the shorts had a very specific thing to do. There was a specific use for them in theatrical exhibition. There was a certain expectation. But of course, Walt being Walt, he also knew it was a great proving ground for young animators. So he also knew that there were techniques and ideas that could be explored within those, the story of the multiplane camera being used in the Silly Symphony. The Old Mill really was a test film for Snow White and what could the multiplane camera do. So it is an interesting, almost a parallel pathway that you had. The development of the shorts, the Mickey shorts, the character shorts, the Silly Symphonies were all sort of in another building. When they moved to Burbank, they brought two buildings over from the Hyperion lot and stuck them together. And even today, it's called the Shorts Building. And that's where that unit was self-contained.
Yeah, Jeff, this has been so interesting. Thank you for going on this little classical music journey with me. I knew you were the perfect guy to talk to about this.
Because I'm so fancy, like classical.
Because you're so fancy. That's right. Jeff Fancy Curdy. There we
That's
go.
me.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, I'm always happy to be invited. I appreciate it.
Now, folks, if you haven't tuned into the last 2 weeks of Disney Coast to Coast, you'll definitely want to check those out, as I spoke with one of the co-authors of the book Holiday Magic at the Disney Parks, where we talk about so much holiday goodness. And next Wednesday, it is the Season 7 finale of Disney Coast to Coast, featuring one of my favorite stories and the perfect co-host for that particular conversation. I'll leave it at that, so be sure to tune in next week. The easiest way to make sure you don't miss any of the magic is by subscribing to Disney Coast to Coast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Wherever you search, don't forget, it's Disney with a Z, Coast to Coast. And now, don't forget to click on that link in this episode's description to order the DCTC 2021 calendar before it's too late. And also, I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to members of the DCTC community over at patreon.com/DisneyCTC. Thank you to Sarah, Skylar, Joshua, Jeanette, Leah, Faith, Bonnie, Jeffrey, Gerardo, Jared, Rio, Philip, Anna, James, Diego, and Monet. It's because of these fantastic folks that I'm able to produce more and more free episodes of Disney Coast to Coast. So if you're able to help support the show and are interested in gaining bonuses at the same time, visit patreon.com/DisneyCTC so that I can continue to make more free episodes for the entirety of 2021. That's patreon.com/DIZNEYCTC. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!
Thanks for listening to Disney Coast to Coast. Have a magical day.
Disney Coast to Coast is produced and hosted by Jeff DePauli. Learn more about the podcast and become a supporter at DisneyCoastToCoast.com. This podcast is part of the Podcast Network. Learn more about this show, plus find more quality and entertaining podcasts at thepodcastnetwork.com. That's DEPodcastNetwork.com.